Baldur's Gate 3 is a wonderful game full of wonderful characters, but I think it's fair to say that none of them are perfect. So, like I did with Elden Ring, I think it would be fun to compare the 7 origin characters to the 7 deadly sins. But what exactly are those 7 sins? They are gluttony, greed, wrath, sloth, lust, pride, and envy. Now, when I assigned sins to each of the shard bearers in Elden Ring, it didn't feel that personal. However, in Baldur's Gate 3, the origin characters are all characters that I think most of us are fairly attached to. So, how about this? I'll talk about how each character exemplifies a sin at the beginning of the game, and then how by the end of the game, they are able to redeem themselves by representing one of the 7 heavenly virtues. Oh, right, the 7 virtues. Those are temperance, charity, patience, diligence, chastity, humility, and kindness. Now, before we get started, please remember that this video is just a fun excuse to talk about a game that I love, and it shouldn't be taken all too seriously. If your thoughts and ideas differ from mine, then that's totally cool. All you gotta do is write down your grievances on a little slip of paper, and then next time you take a dump, wipe your butt with it. Nah, I'm just kidding. You can leave a comment. I do actually want to know what you guys think versus the conclusions that I have come to. And while you're wiping your butt with one hand, you should hit the subscribe button with the other. We all know everyone's got their phone with them on the toilet these days. Alright, enough poop talk. Let's get into it. Gluttony is the first sin we'll touch on today, and frankly, this might be the easiest entry on the list. The character that absolutely screams glutton is Gale. Gale is not a bad person, but boy does that man have some issues. His insatiable appetite for magic and knowledge is immediately apparent. Gale is a wizard, a fact he's willing to make very clear. As a wizard, he's automatically driven to learn more and more about spells and all things magical. As the lover of Mystra, he sought to peer behind the veil and view magic in a light that few mortals had ever dreamed possible. But where Gale goes overboard is in his greatest and most reckless act, attempting to restore a fragment of the weave, the Karlach weave, to Mystra. But rather than this being the wonderful and romantic act he had envisioned, Gale accidentally absorbed that Karlach weave into himself, resulting in the ticking magical bomb he carries with him throughout his journey in Baldur's Gate 3. This event forced Gale into a very literal form of gluttony. He must now consume powerful magical artifacts to keep his explosive condition in check. What began as a genuine curiosity and a desire for knowledge so quickly spiraled into uncontrollable hunger, consuming not just the artifacts, but Gale's own sense of self-worth. This is where we find our handsome wizard friend when we first meet him in our playthrough. Well, we find him in a magical wormhole thing, but you get what I mean. As you progress through the game, and more specifically Gale's own quest line, he will come to a sort of crossroads. Gale can either delve deeper into his pit of gluttony, which can lead him to either becoming a literal god, or he can die pursuing that godhood, fully wasting his potential and throwing everything away. Or, the path that I always prefer for Gale to take, he can realize that maybe he's gone too far, reached further than he should, and gotten lucky enough to even still be alive. In this ending, Gale counters the sin of gluttony with the virtue of temperance. He can temper his hunger, he can return the crown of Karsus to Mystra for safekeeping, and he can accept his own humanity. If he does this, he'll become a professor at the Blackstaff Academy in Waterdeep, teaching young, aspiring wizards the art of illusion magic. Though, of course, he does tell us that he tried to teach every class in the academy, but like he tempered himself before, he's accepted that maybe one class is enough. Gale is an interesting look into what's referred to as the disease of more, and how you can achieve greatness and self-actualization without having to chase reckless ambition. In this ending, Gale goes down in history as one of the greatest wizards to ever do it, and it's all thanks to not giving into his gluttony and instead accepting temperance. If you watched my video about who was the strongest companion before the tadpole, you might remember a fun fact about Lae'zel, that being that she is only 22 years old. She's the youngest of the companions, which makes her incredibly susceptible to the, to put it lightly, rigid expectations of her people, an upbringing that makes her a solid example of the sin of greed. Not greed in the traditional materialistic sense, for the most part, but greed for status, for strength, and for glory. Like I said, Lae'zel is a product of Githyanki culture, a culture built on ambition, conquest, and domination. From birth, she was taught that power is everything, and that ultimate power can only be achieved by ascending. Like all young Githyanki, she was led to believe that to ascend was to be honored by her queen Vlaakith, to become the perfect ideal warrior in her name. But as we later learn, ascension is not what it seems. Vlaakith is not honoring champions, she's consuming them to sustain and grow her own power. When we first meet Lae'zel, she embodies embodies this typical Githyanki mindset completely, unwaveringly. She is single-minded in her belief that only her people can provide a cure for the Illithid tadpole. She sees non-Githyanki as lesser beings, tolerating them only if and for as long as she deems them useful. If, during your playthrough you let her, she'll mentally torture Zoru without a second thought, just for some information about where she can find her people. And man, don't even get me started about her, how you say, directness in the bedroom? It seems like overthinking, but this is clearly just a reflection of her belief that desires, whether for power or pleasure, should be pursued without hesitation or concern for others. Or to put it more bluntly, that girl will fuck you sore. Lae'zel doesn't hesitate. She takes, and I think I hear Hamilton music, but the point is, that is the essence of her greed. Take what I need when I need it. It's possible for Lae'zel's story to continue on this very path. She'll see nothing more important than ascending, and eventually will befall the fate we mentioned earlier, where she becomes a snack for Vlaakith. But it doesn't have to go that way. As Baldur's Gate 3 progresses, she has the opportunity to challenge everything she has ever known. With a little nudge in the right direction from yourself and Voss, she realizes the devastating reality. Her queen is not a benevolent ruler, but a tyrant, a parasite consuming her own people to sustain herself, and is honestly no better than the Gake that her people so despise. And that realization is what allows Lae'zel to change. If she embraces this truth, Lae'zel's mission transforms. She no longer fights for herself alone, she fights to free Orpheus, and through him, free her people. This is where the sin of greed gives way to the virtue of charity. Charity, in this case, isn't about literal generosity and like giving things out, it's about selflessness. It's about sacrificing personal ambition for the good of others. Lae'zel is choosing the harder path, where she abandons the comforts of blind devotion and instead fights for the liberation of all Githyanki, not just herself. For a character who once sought nothing but personal glory, the decision to reject that path and instead lead her people to freedom is one of the most profound acts of charity in the game. And this is just a personal adage, but I think because of all this, she's probably one of the most interesting and compelling companions in the game. Okay, so I said before that Gale had maybe the easiest entry on the list, but right up there with him is the real main character of Baldur's Gate 3, the Dark Urge. Go ahead, take a guess what the sin is. That's right, guys, it's lust. Nah, I'm just kidding. Obviously, the Dark Urge is the epitome of the sin of wrath. Not just any old boring wrath either. I'm talking divine, unstoppable, murder god tier wrath. Now, not everyone played Baldur's Gate 3 as the Dark Urge. In fact, I'm pretty sure most people didn't. So, I think we should spend a little time talking about who the Dark Urge was so that we can understand where we find them at the beginning of our journey and how they can change. The Dark Urge is what's known in the land of Faerûn as a ballspawn. Ballspawn is a very literal definition. They are the descendants of the god of murder, Baal. It's a long and very complicated story, but really all that's important is that Baal once came to the mortal plane disguised as a man and, impregnated a lot of women. He did this to preserve his godhood in the event that he would himself be killed, which he actually was, so this move kept his legacy and some of his spirit alive. Although he could not exactly take physical form, Baal was able to act through his spawn. That's where we get characters like Sarevok from Baldur's Gate 1, and more importantly to today's story, Orin the Red. Orin is actually the incestual result of Sarevok and his own daughter, which... This Baal stuff is really weird, I know, but Orin would grow to become a true specimen of Baal, a murderous, evil, twisted individual. But she was overshadowed. There was another Baal spawn who was different, a true, literal form of Baal himself, a creature born solely of the blood, sweat, and tears of the murder god known to us as the Dark Urge. The Dark Urge was everything Baal had hoped for and more, the living incarnation of bloodlust and murder. The Dark Urge became the chosen of Baal, like how Ketheric was the chosen of Merkel and Gortash was the chosen of Bane. And Dirge traveled around Faerûn, killing in their father's name. That, of course, is where we loop back around to the topic of this entry, the sin of wrath. I cannot possibly overstate how literal an example of wrath that Dirge is. But this is all happening before the events of the game, and when we eventually take control of this character, it's under much different circumstances. Remember Orin, the skin-wearing freak I mentioned a minute ago? Well, she was desperate to become Baal's favorite, so she attempted to kill the Dark Urge and usurp them, but she only exceeded partially in accomplishing that. She did get rid of Dirge, wiping their memory in the process, but she wasn't able to fully kill them. Regardless, she does become Baal's chosen, and that's where we find the Dark Urge at the start of Baldur's Gate 3, lost, confused, and with absolutely zero memory of their past life of ultra-violence. But that wrath, oh, it's still in there. Left unchecked, the Dark Urge will slaughter people. Rest in peace, Alfira. But this is where the virtue of patience comes into play. Throughout the entire rest of your playthrough as the Dark Urge, you're given choices, and if you so choose, you can exercise the virtue of patience to steel yourself and resist your urges. By resisting the sin of wrath, you are rewarded with allies that trust and care for you, especially if you're romancing one of the companions. They'll help and encourage you all the way until you face off against Orin. After defeating her, you have an incredibly important decision to make. Become Baal's chosen like you were meant to and once were, giving in completely to that wrath deep inside, or continue resisting his influence and figure out your own destiny. If you do defy him, Baal will straight up kill you. But like before, by exercising patience, you are once again rewarded. This time your life is restored to you by Withers, or Jurgle, cause he's Jurgle, and this allows you to continue your quest to stop the Nether Brain and is a great example of how patience can overcome wrath. In most people's minds, the sin of lust is a pretty surface-level idea, usually being whittled down to sexual desires. But it's more than that. I mean, you can lust for anything. Some lust for pleasure, yes, but some people lust for things like power. Astarion is a character who has struggled with both of these things. Now, when talking about this specific subject, I want to be mindful. Astarion's story is incredibly sad, and parts of it may be potentially triggering for some people, so I'll do my best to be sensitive about this section. Astarion's story goes as follows. He was once a normal dude working as a magistrate in the city of Baldur's Gate. One day, after they didn't like a decision he had made, a group of Gur beat Astarion to near death. To the rescue, though, came Cazador. Cazador is what's known as a vampire lord, a more matured and powerful version of a vampire. Cazador gave Astarion a choice, either die here in the street or become a vampire and live eternally. Astarion, literally dying, chose self-preservation and was turned into a vampire. This decision would backfire more than anyone could have imagined. I talked a lot about Astarion's past in my Before the Tadpole video, so I won't dive too deep into most parts of the next roughly 200 years of torment that Astarion endured under Cazador's heel, but there is one important thing to note for this video specifically. During his time in the Tsar Palace, Astarion was permitted to leave every once in a while, meaning he could temporarily slink back into the city. The only reason he was allowed out, though, was so that he could find suitable sacrifices for Cazador to feed on. Astarion would meet someone at an inn, tavern, or what have you, he would charm them, as he's so skilled at doing, and then for many of them, he would lay with them. In Act 2, Astarion tells us this.
I had nothing at all for so long. Not even my body. That was owned by Cazador, to be sent out to tempt fools into his palace. I have bedded thousands of people. Half of them I barely remember. Most of them didn't even grant me temporary bliss.
The only tiny sliver of light that comes from this depressing saga of Astarion's life is told to us later in Act 3, when Astarion is talking about types of people he's seduced over the years.
Many of them are petty criminals, street drunkards, and brothel goers. But from time to time, there was a Sebastian.
Sebastian is one of Astarion's first victims, and is one of the unfortunate many that were turned into spawn simply to be used by Cazador as fodder in the vampire ascension ritual. Astarion's past is a brutal, upsetting mess, and is riddled with the sexual desires aspect of the sin of lust. I mean, of course he wanted love, and to connect with people. Cazador would lock Astarion in a room by himself for a whole fucking year. How could he not want some emotional and physical intimacy? It's not Astarion's fault that he was forced to bring people to Cazador. It's not his fault that he would seek out some comfort. But the other side of lust comes into play well after our playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3 has begun. In Act 3, Astarion confronts Cazador, and like the other characters thus far, he's given a very important decision. He defeats his master, and now has the option to either complete the ritual himself and chase the unimaginable power that becoming a vampire ascendant would give him, or he could put a stop to the whole thing. He could free the poor souls that have met this terrible fate, partially at his and his siblings' hands. He could reject the lust for power that so overwhelmed his tormentor's heart. And the best ending for him, of course, is to choose this second path. By denying that power, Astarion gives us a great example of the counter virtue to lust, that being chastity. Chastity from the tainted and evil power he would have achieved, and chastity from becoming an even worse monster than Cazador. And by choosing to let go of that hunger, Astarion becomes something he never thought he could be, his own person. Wyll Ravengard is a character who goes out of his way time and time again to be a good person, whether it be saving the lives of innocent people or teaching positive life lessons to not-so-fortunate children. He does, though, also go out of his way to associate himself with one of the 7 deadly sins, that of course being the sin of pride. Wyll refers to himself throughout the game as the Pride of the Gate, which is obviously just a fun title, but this gives us a window into the way that Wyll thinks about himself. Wyll was raised in the city of Baldur's Gate by his father, Duke Ulder Ravengard. His dad taught him 4 pillars of being a good man: courage, insight, strategy, and justice. These 4 traits were nailed into Wyll's head, and they drove him throughout his life. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of that. The problem comes in later in life when Wyll is so proud and confident of the man he was becoming that he would risk everything to save his city. When Wyll slept one night, he heard a voice whisper to him, "Dusthawk Hill, the Queen of Chaos awakens, go alone." And so he does. He takes his trusty rapier and sets out to confront whatever great evil was brewing. But like, dude, take some help with you. I know it says go alone, but Wyll was only 17 when this happened. The boy was way out of his league. But that's the thing about Wyll. He's a hero. He's confident. In that Before the Tadpole video, I talked a lot about how Wyll is incredibly confident and frankly deserves to be. He's strong, he's smart, and he'd do anything to help innocent people, but it's that pride in who he is that just may get him in trouble. This is the exact same sort of trap that Wyll falls into again in Act 3. Wyll is told that to save the city, he needs to go into the Worm Way and get help from a slumbering dragon. The idea sounds ridiculous, but hey, again, Wyll would do anything to save his people, even something as crazy as this. And so you go down there, you do meet the dragon, and he's not exactly what Wyll expected. Answer was at one point a great and noble dragon, sure, but now he's an undead monster, driven by revenge and determined to kill your party. And so look, now you're stuck fighting a dragon. It was all done with the best intentions, but Wyll's determination to help is constantly causing issues for him and may put people around him in danger as well. Now, let's introduce the opposite sin of pride, humility. The characters we've talked about thus far have all had a virtue be represented by their transformation mid-game and exemplified by a specific one of their endings. For Wyll, it's a little different. Wyll, while prideful, displays his virtue way before we even meet him. Remember the whole Queen of Chaos thing? Well, Wyll was forced to make a pact with Mizora to gain the power to stop the Cult of the Dragon that night and save Baldur's Gate. But he wasn't able to explain to his father why he was now traveling around with a devil, and so Wyll was cast out. Wyll didn't put up a fight. Wyll didn't hold any resentment, and instead, he went into the world at large and defended it in every way he could, thus becoming the Blade of Frontiers. This, to me, is why Wyll is such a compelling character. He's constantly trying to do right by people, he ends up getting in deeper waters than he maybe should, but he'll accept whatever the punishment or consequences are so that he can continue saving others. As far as endings go, I'd say he has a few good ones, but I do really personally like the ending where he just remains the Blade of Frontiers. Some people might disagree and feel like maybe this ending doesn't show his growth as a character, but I don't really think he needed to grow that much. He was already a good person, he's just a little reckless. And you know what, as long as Wyll is out there keeping up the good fight, I'd say the Sword Coast is a better place for it. Karlach is an absolute sweetheart. Her, Gale, and Wyll are really the only companions who are very clearly in the good alignment. But Karlach isn't without her flaws. Her story is sort of similar to Astarion's in that they both made decisions that seemed like a good idea in the moment, but would eventually lead to terrible outcomes. Karlach's decision was to work with a man named Gortash, a silver-tongued charlatan with a rough past of his own. Gortash was someone who wanted to rise to the top and would do anything to get there, even sacrifice his his new friend Karlach. Gortash sold Karlach to Zariel, who in turn would perform a terrible experiment on the poor girl. Zariel had Karlach's heart removed, and in its stead was placed an infernal engine. This machine would fire Karlach up and make her more powerful, but at the cost of a few things. Namely, Karlach now couldn't make physical contact with anyone without burning them, and she would have a hard time controlling her new, now very heightened emotions. Then Karlach was forced to fight as Zariel's weapon during the Blood War, a war taking place in Avernus. This is where we can now introduce Karlach's sin, the sin of envy. In Avernus, Karlach would long to be free, to be back home, and to no longer have that damned machine inside of her. And who could blame her? She had everything she'd ever known taken away from her just to be replaced by a new horrifying reality. Again, like Astarion, this sin isn't her fault. She didn't ask to be sent to Avernus, she didn't ask to be a guinea pig, and she didn't ask to battle demons for 8 decades straight. When Karlach does find her opportunity to escape, coming in the form of the Nautiloid passing through Avernus, she takes it immediately, because what could possibly be worse than living the life she was already stuck living? On the ship, she's tadpoled, and when we encounter her later in the game, Karlach is in quite a state. Her infernal engine is running real hot now that it's out of the hells, but that's not really what she's concerned with. Karlach, being the sweetheart that I mentioned, wants to be free of the tadpole, yes, but even more, she's finally surrounded by normal people, and she is desperate to have some sort of intimacy. Not even sexually, just Karlach wants to be able to hug somebody, but she can't. Not yet, at least. If you're involved romantically with another companion, Karlach will mention how she's a little jealous of what you have, and how she wishes that she could be physical with people in some way. Thankfully, you can help her out later on, and finally give her a little love, but poor Karlach was forced to be consumed by envy for so long. But what's the counter virtue to the sin of envy? Well, it's another thing that Karlach exudes: kindness. Karlach doesn't let her yearning turn to spite. Like I said, she's one of the only characters that we can point to and say, yes, this is a good person. Karlach, even though she has been through very literal hell, is still incredibly pleasant when you meet her. She's immediately willing to team up, she's probably the nicest and kindest companion to you, especially early on, and it's cliche, and also very literal again, but Karlach is the type of person to light up a room. Even with the hardships she's had to endure, she's still able to put others before herself. But Karlach doesn't really get a happy ending. Every other character gets some sort of happiness, some type of redemption, but Karlach's situation is too dire. By the end of the game, Karlach's engine is ready to pop, and her options are either to return to Avernus, where she'll be instantly hunted down, or to just let it happen. Let the engine take her down with it and rid herself of any more suffering. There's also an ending where she can become a mind flayer, and then she gets to like live as a mind flayer, but I think that ending sucks, because it's not really her anymore. She also is still able to go to Avernus with Wyll, but honestly, I still think that ending is kind of a bummer. I mean, now Karlach and Wyll will have to fight and scrape by every day for the rest of their lives. In one final act of kindness, this time to herself, I think it might be best for Karlach to let it all go. We know she's earned a happy afterlife, and so, in this ending, Karlach is able to stave off the sin of envy and live a life full of joy and kindness. Shadowheart is an interesting case because I feel like she doesn't necessarily embody any of the sins in a way that a lot of the others do. That being said, I do think that her religious beliefs are very reflective of the last sin we have yet to talk about, the sin of sloth. Shadowheart, at the start of the game at least, is a worshipper of the goddess Shar. Shar sucks. She is also known as the Lady of Loss, a goddess associated with giving up all your own personal desires to live a life of comfort in Shar alone. Sharans are meant to love and worship only Shar. They are meant to abandon any ideas of happiness and greatness outside of their religion, instead only being allowed to pursue the idea of gaining more of Shar's favor, potentially becoming a Dark Justiciar. This, in my eyes, is incredibly lame. But how exactly did Shadowheart fall into the trap of being one of Shar's followers? Well, like some of the others, it wasn't her fault. Shadowheart was once a Selûnite, Selûne being the opposing goddess to Shar. Selûne is the goddess of the moon, of moonlight, and is meant to be an inspiration to her followers, not an obsession. During a Selûnite ritual, Shadowheart, then named Genevieve, was accosted by a group of Sharans. They took her away from her family, and to scorn the goddess Selûne, they wanted to turn a Selûnite into a Sharan, and then they raised her under the Sharan dogma. Now, Shadowheart would grow grow up and follow a very strange cycle of sloth and the opposing virtue, diligence. You see, Shadowheart was pretty quickly turned to Shar, which, like I explained, is a life that I would describe as slothful because you're not chasing any of your own ambitions or goals, you're just basically giving up your life and pretending that Shar will take care of you. But Shadowheart was, at the same time, constantly questioning things, constantly trying to learn, and constantly standing against her mother superior. That's where the diligence comes in, because while Shadowheart was falling to the life of a Sharan, she was also determined to keep her own individual and very stubborn personality. She's eventually sent on a mission to retrieve the artifact, and that's when she's taken aboard the Nautiloid. Shadowheart's journey, like so many of the others, comes to a fork in the road. She can either decide to please Shar and become a dark justiciar, or she can keep fighting like she always has and turn against that dark path. Obviously, the better choice is clear. If Shadowheart resists, then she'll eventually abandon and be abandoned by Shar. This is when she exudes that virtue of diligence, because instead of accepting that she's failed, that she can no longer please Shar, she takes up the mantle of Selûne, like she once did, and returns onto the path of light. She can go as far as battling the Sharans who captured her, and freeing her parents from their clutches. But personally, I think the better ending, and the ending that best exemplifies diligence, is when Shadowheart accepts that her parents have suffered enough. She lets them go, officially untethering herself from Shar. Then, after defeating the Netherbrain, Shadowheart will move on to begin freeing others of the Sharan path of evil, teaching people that it's okay to be your own person. Shadowheart is a complex and interesting character, but one that does, the whole way, show off that virtue of diligence. So, in the end, every character has their issues, and that's kind of the beauty of Baldur's Gate 3. They all have struggles, but they're all also able to overcome them, able to grow, and able to improve right alongside you. That's part of why I love the game so much, and is why I'm especially attached to this group of characters. I hope you all had fun watching, and just a little reminder, I know not every line of logic in this video is 100% perfect, but this is all just for fun, and I always love having a reason to talk about some of my favorite games. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, then you should definitely subscribe, because I'm not done with my yap sessions just yet. Thank you guys all so much for watching. I hope to see you all next time. GG's, everybody.